Privet Katila Wanengruski desu. In the year 1965, the trajectory of this great American nation was twisted and turned so as to send us to our own demise and ruin. And you can argue that it was simply just one of the many deceitful ways that our nation and Western civilization as a whole was led to our current path of destruction. But whatever philosophy school you take, which one's the worst one and which one's not, what you have to understand is that none of them were sold to us as that it will lead to our destruction. Nothing really is at all in life. And what am I talking about? Well, it's a little act called the Heart Cellar Act of 1965, a law that put a nail to the coffin of traditional Americana and spearheaded us towards our destruction. You want to know how America as a nation went from a mostly majority Northwest European nation to one that within 80 years of this bill's passing will have peoples of European descent be a minority? Well, despite being replaced in our own lands and America slowly turning into an international cesspool, which has no roots, no identity, or any such thing, was this what the people who passed this wanted? Was this what we were sold? Well, unfortunately, we were lied to. So what do I mean by that? What do I mean that we were lied to? What were we told about this bill? Well, one of the most staunch supporters of this bill, Senator Edward Kennedy himself, he wanted to address the critics in a Senate speech. He's like, okay, so I'm going to talk to the critics about this bill. So what did he say? What did he promise? Quote, out of the deference to the critics, I want to comment on what this bill will not do. First, our cities will not be flooded with 1 million immigrants annually. Under the proposed bill, the present level of immigration remains substantially the same. Secondly, the ethnic mix of this country will not be upset. Contrary to the charges in some quarters, the bill will not inundate Americans with immigrants from any one country or area or the most populated and economically deprived nations of Africa and Asia. In the final analysis, the ethnic pattern of immigration under the proposed measure is not expected to change as sharply as the critics seem to think. Thirdly, the bill will not permit the entry of subversive persons, criminals, illiterates, or those with contagious diseases or serious mental illnesses. As I noted a moment ago, no immigrant visa will be issued to a person who is likely to become a public charge. The charges I have mentioned are highly emotional, irrational, and with little foundational fact. They are out of line with the obligations of responsible citizenship, and they breed hate of our heritage. So let's examine what he said, shall we? And, was what he said right? Let's take this point by point. Let's see if he was telling the truth. And the points are, 1, that our nation will not be flooded with 1 million immigrants annually, and that immigration levels will stay about the same as they are now. The second point that he made is that the ethnic mix of this country will not be disturbed, and we won't be flooded from a particular group of people. The patterns of immigration will substantially remain from Europe. 3, that they won't become a public charge. And 4, that it will not allow in criminals, illiterates, people with disease and mental illness. Only the top tier people will be allowed to immigrate. So let's examine these 4 points. And was he right? So, were we flooded with 1 million immigrants annually? Well, he's actually right in that. We weren't. And we aren't. Because it's a lot worse than just 1 million. In 2016, when accounting just for purely legal residents, over 1.18 million immigrants came to America. Now, keep in mind, this does not even account for the countless amount of illegal immigrants that come in every year. So was Edward Kennedy right? Well, if by right in that he vastly understated how many immigrants would be coming into this country, so much so that 14.4% of the country is foreign-born, not including those born outside the nation. And, I'm just teasing, of course. He meant that immigration levels would stay, as he mentioned, the immigration levels would stay the same. And at the time of that bill's passing, that was about 165,000 people a year. So he was off by about 1 million. Let's look at the second point now, that the ethnic mix of this country would not be disturbed and we aren't going to be flooded from one particular ethnic group. Well, we know that was a disastrous failing on his guess. So in 1965, about 88% of the U.S. population was white, with the black population being at about 10%, and the other 2% were the sum total of all the Asians, the Hispanics, and everyone else. But how about now? So I know we're like 10 years away from the last official census, so I will use the U.S. Census estimates for 2018. In that year, the non-Hispanic white population is a mere 60% of the population. Hispanics are about 16% of the population. Blacks made up about 12%. Asians are 5.6% of the population, and the rest are mixed race, Indians, etc. So whites are projected, if current trends continue, to become a minority by 2044, and be only 43% of the population by 2060. So in about 100 years' time, we're going to become barely, almost, 2/5 of the population, right? Something like that. So I guess from almost being 9/10. So I guess the ethnic balance was really messed with if the trends are right. So what did you say? So all right, but I'm sure that's because of something else, right? It's not actually because of immigration, right? Well, actually that's wrong, because overwhelmingly the amount of mostly illegal and legal immigration comes from, actually I think it's just legal, but most illegal immigration or people of immigrant background are from Mexico, vast majority, followed by China, India, and the Philippines. So much for not being flooded from countries from Asia and such. Alright, so all the things we've mentioned so far are lies. At least they are not a public charge, right? And, and they, actually contribute to our society. So, I'm sure that, because we're being replaced by total foreigners, but despite being replaced and our nation being drastically flooded and changed, at least they contribute. They're hardworking, right? Well, it shouldn't surprise you that Kennedy was wrong again. So according to statistics, 63% of households headed by a non-citizen use a welfare program, as compared to 35% of native households. If you don't want to include the earned income tax credit, that changes to 58% for non-citizens and 30% for natives. If you want to break down specifics, 45% of non-citizens collect food stamps as opposed to 21% for natives. Medicaid is taken by 50% of non-citizens compared to 23% for natives. So when you look at all these welfare programs, our immigration policy, so as for if our immigration policy does not let in people who would be a public charge, because if that was the case, if that's what would happen, then you would expect that the natives would use more welfare than immigrants, because if you're an immigrant come in, you would have to assumingly prove they can't be a public charge. Well, apparently not. So if we're importing tons of people who are on welfare, great. Alright, so I'm going to go on the last point here. So surely, despite all that, we don't bring in, criminals, people with mental illnesses, and illiterates into the country, right? Well, throughout multiple so-called immigration reform in the past, let's start with this point. We have legalized millions of illegal immigrants, and there are tens of millions of illegal immigrants in our nation today because of our weak border and immigration policy. So obviously, we're bringing in tons of illegal migrants. Another part, if you're 50 years of age or older, you don't have to know how to read, write, or even speak English. And this is waived completely for those who claim to be disabled, so basically we are bringing in illiterates, and not only that, if you're a cripple, you're blind, you're deaf, or whatever, you can still become a citizen of the United States. Now, as for criminality, if you have committed a really bad violent felony, you are barred from becoming a citizen. So, okay, that's if you murder someone, you're not allowed to come in. Okay, I guess that's right. But what about other crimes? Well, in terms of good moral character, what does that mean? Well, if you commit these acts, if you do these acts I'm about to list, they could be waived. So you could do these acts and still come in. If you had a drug violation, you're a habitual drunkard, you've done illegal gambling, you had an extramarital affair or adultery, you voted when you were not a citizen, you did spousal abuse, child abuse, something like all those things. If you did that, you could be waived. It could be waived away, and you actually be allowed to still come in. So these are just fine people that we're letting in, huh? So we, the American people, were lied to, as shown overwhelmingly. We were told that immigration changes would not affect this nation And yet, as we have seen, it has totally transformed our nation. And we must fix this. Aim high, wander on, from America with Russian love.